The clock on the FBI's wall read 3:15 p.m. January 13th, 1983. Miami Beach. A small apartment off Collins Avenue. Inside, a frail 80-year-old man sat in a worn armchair, watching reruns and chain-smoking unfiltered cigarettes. His name was Meyer Lansky. His doctors gave him weeks. The Bureau gave him no peace. For nearly 50 years they had hunted his money. Bank accounts in Switzerland, shell companies in the Bahamas, casinos skim from Havana to Las Vegas. A fortune they estimated at $300 million. They found nothing. 2 days later, on January 15th, the cancer in his lungs would finally close the case they could never close themselves. He died with the secrets still in his head. That's where the movie starts. Lansky, 2021. Harvey Keitel, playing the old man. Sam Worthington playing the journalist. David Stone, sent to listen. A dying mobster telling stories to a writer who needs a paycheck, while federal agents watch the parking lot, hoping the old man slips just once. The film wants you to see a tired patriarch, wise, weary, almost gentle. But the real Meyer Lansky was the man who helped turn crime into a corporation. The Jewish kid from the Lower East Side who sat across from Lucky Luciano and rewrote the rules of the American underworld. The financial brain behind a syndicate that moved more money than most Fortune 500 companies of its era, and the ghost the FBI chased into his grave. This is the story of how a 5'4" immigrant from Grodno became one of the most dangerous men behind the American Mafia, how he built an empire out of prohibition liquor, Cuban casinos, and Las Vegas concrete. And why, when he finally died, the United States government walked away empty-handed. Here's what the film hints at, but never fully shows. Lansky didn't just survive the mob wars of the 20th century. He helped design the system that made the mob untouchable. And to understand how, you have to go back to the tenements of the Lower East Side before anyone called him Meyer Lansky at all. He was born Meyer Sucholyansky on July 4th, 1902, in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire. When U.S. officials couldn't pin down his birthday, they simply assigned him the 4th of July. His family was fleeing the pogroms of the Pale of Settlement. His father went ahead to America in 1909. His mother followed in 1911, boarding a ship with Meyer and his younger brother Jacob. He was a boy of about 9 when he arrived in New York. The family settled first in Brooklyn, then in the cold-water tenements of the Lower East Side. His father pressed garments in the needle trade. His mother kept kosher and prayed her sons would become rabbis or doctors. Neither happened. By his teens, Meyer had a new name, Meyer Lansky, and a reputation. He was small, quiet. He didn't fight unless he had to. But when he fought, he won. The famous story goes that on his walk home from school, an Italian kid tried to shake him down for protection money. Lansky refused, defiant, and took the beating rather than pay. The Italian kid was Salvatore Lucania. The world would come to know him as Lucky Luciano. Luciano respected the younger boy's nerve, and a partnership was born. That alliance, Jewish boy and Sicilian boy, would last more than 60 years. It would survive prohibition. It would survive prison. It would survive deportation. And it would help build the framework for organized crime in America. In the movie, the journalist asks the old man how it all started.
Let's start when you were a child.
Keitel's Lansky smiles. He talks about loyalty, about handshakes, about the old neighborhood. The real story is colder than that. Lansky and Luciano made a pact early. The Italians had numbers. The Jews had brains. Together they would not be muscled out by the Irish, the Poles, or the old Sicilian mustache Petes, who still thought the rackets belonged to the old country. In 1920, the United States went dry. Prohibition, the greatest gift ever handed to a generation of street kids willing to break the law. Lansky partnered with a wild, reckless, handsome maniac named Benjamin Siegel. Bugsy to his enemies, never Bugsy to his face. Together they ran the Bugs and Meyer mob out of garages on the Lower East Side. They started with bootlegging. Trucks running Canadian whiskey down from Montreal, boats running rum up from the Caribbean. By the mid-1920s, the Bugs and Meyer mob was one of the most feared bootlegging crews on the East Coast, part of the so-called Big Seven network. They were making, by various estimates, tens of thousands of dollars a week, tax-free, cash, in a city where a steel worker made $25 a week. But here's where Lansky started to separate himself from every other gangster of his generation. While Siegel chased women and headlines, Lansky studied numbers. He understood something the others did not. Liquor was temporary. Prohibition would end. The real money was not in the product. The real money was in the system. By 1929, he was already moving. That May, in Atlantic City, a meeting took place that the movie barely touches. Lansky was there, Luciano was there, Al Capone came up from Chicago, Frank Costello, Johnny Torrio, bosses from across the country, one of the first major national crime conferences in American history. Lansky listened and counted. Luciano had been planning for years, was simple and revolutionary. Stop killing each other, carve up territories, share rackets. Treat the underworld like a corporation, with a board of directors, dispute resolution, and shared investment. No more Mustache Pete wars. No more public massacres. Quiet money, steady money, forever money. It would take more blood. In 1931, Luciano arranged the murder of Joe Masseria at a restaurant in Coney Island. Months later, Salvatore Maranzano was killed in his Park Avenue office. The old order was gone. In its place rose what they called the Commission, and alongside it, something Lansky helped design, the National Crime Syndicate, a multi-ethnic, nationwide network of Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangsters who would now do business together. In the film, this whole transformation is condensed into a few lines of dialogue. The real version took years and left dozens of bodies in alleys from Brooklyn to Chicago. Now here's the part the movie really softens. People love to call Lansky the accountant, the brain, the nice quiet one. The truth is uglier. Lansky was tied to Murder Incorporated, the syndicate's enforcement arm. Between 1930 and 1941, Murder Incorporated is believed to have carried out somewhere between 400 and 1,000 contract killings across the United States. Lansky didn't pull triggers. He understood that violence, used precisely, was just another column on a balance sheet. There's a line attributed to him, picked up on an FBI wiretap and repeated in Robert Lacey's biography, Little Man, We're Bigger Than U.S. Steel. He reportedly said it to his wife while watching a news story on the Mafia. It would later echo as a famous line in The Godfather Part 2. And in 1940, he wasn't far wrong. Then came the war. 1942. German U-boats were sinking American ships off the East Coast. The Navy was paranoid about sabotage on the New York docks, which were heavily influenced by the Italian mob. So the United States government did something it would later spend decades downplaying. It made a deal with Lucky Luciano, who was sitting in prison serving a 30 to 50-year sentence. The middleman was Meyer Lansky. He sat in meetings with naval intelligence officers. He carried messages. He helped guarantee the docks would be watched, and that Sicilian contacts would assist the American invasion of Sicily in 1943. They called it Operation Underworld. The film glances at this, but the implication is staggering. The United States government, at high levels, quietly partnered with the American underworld during World War II, and one of the men brokering it was a 5'4" Jewish gangster from Grodno. When the war ended, Luciano was rewarded with deportation to Italy. Lansky was free, and he saw the future before anyone else did. The future was not in liquor anymore. The future was in gambling. He had already been building since the late 1930s, illegal casinos in Saratoga, New York, carpet joints in Broward County, Florida, the Colonial Inn in Hallandale. These were not backroom dice games. These were full casinos with chandeliers, orchestras, and chefs flown in from New York. Lansky's model was simple. make it look legitimate, pay off the local sheriff, and run honest games so the high rollers kept coming back. But the real prize was 90 miles south of Florida, Cuba. In 1933, a Cuban army sergeant named Fulgencio Batista seized power in a revolt. Batista loved money. Lansky had money. The friendship was inevitable. After Batista grabbed power again in a 1952 coup, Lansky became, in effect, the gambling czar of a sovereign nation. Think about that. A convicted bootlegger advising a government on its casinos. In December 1946, Lansky helped organize the Havana Conference at the Hotel Nacional. Major American bosses came down. Luciano slipped in from Italy, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Santo Trafficante. Bugsy Siegel came too, and that's important, because he was already in trouble. They divided up the future while Frank Sinatra performed. Cuba would belong to the syndicate. Lansky would help run it. By the mid-1950s, Lansky's reach in Havana ran through the Hotel Nacional casino, and eventually the crown jewel, the Riviera, which opened in 1957 with 440 rooms and a casino floor the size of a football field. By some estimates, the skim from Havana funneled enormous sums back to American mob families. Cash. Untaxed. Hard to trace. In the movie, Keitel's Lansky talks about Havana like it was Camelot. The lights, the music, the view of the sea. The reality was darker. The Cuban people lived in poverty while the profits flowed back to Miami and New York. And then, on January 1st, 1959, Batista fled, and Fidel Castro's revolution swept in. Within days, the casinos were stormed and looted, the chips dumped in the streets. Lansky lost, by his own estimate, millions in cash and assets, the empire of a lifetime gone almost overnight. But here's where you understand the difference between Lansky and every other gangster. He didn't break. He didn't go to war. He simply pivoted. He had already been deep into the next thing, Las Vegas. In 1946, Lansky's old partner, Bugsy Siegel, had opened the Flamingo Hotel on the Las Vegas Strip. It was a disaster. Construction ran millions over budget. The opening flopped. The syndicate suspected Siegel and his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, were skimming from the construction funds. At meetings tied to Havana, the bosses turned against Bugsy. The accounts vary, but most historians believe Lansky, who had grown up with Siegel, who loved him like a brother, ultimately could not save him. On June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel sat reading the newspaper in Virginia Hill's living room at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills. A gunman fired through the window. He was killed instantly. Within minutes, Lansky associates moved to take over the Flamingo. That was Meyer Lansky, loyal until the math no longer worked. By the 1960s, Lansky was reputed to hold hidden interests in casinos up and down the Strip. The Sands, the Fremont, the Thunderbird, the Flamingo itself. He had reported interests in the Bahamas. He moved money through Swiss banks, including the Exchange and Investment Bank in Geneva. He became, in the words of more than one investigator who chased him, one of the most sophisticated money movers in American history. And this is what the FBI could not stand. J. Edgar Hoover had, for years, famously downplayed the existence of a national mafia. But after the Appalachian meeting in 1957 exposed dozens of mob bosses to public view, the Bureau changed direction. And one of the men at the top of the list was Meyer Lansky. They wiretapped his phones, they followed his wife, they followed his son Buddy, who had cerebral palsy and whom Lansky adored. They subpoenaed banks. For 2 decades, they could not make a serious case stick. He had no soldiers directly under him. He gave no orders that could be recorded. He kept no books anyone could find. Every dollar moved through layers of cutouts, lawyers, and offshore accounts. In 1970, sensing the walls closing in, Lansky did what wealthy Americans rarely do. He ran. He flew to Israel and applied for citizenship under the law of return, which guaranteed any Jew the right to live in the Jewish state. He spent about 2 years there, living modestly near Tel Aviv, walking on the beach, walking his little dog, eating in cheap cafes. The Israeli Supreme Court eventually ruled against him. In 1972, after a desperate flight bounced from country to country, he was returned to Miami, where federal agents were waiting on the tarmac. The trials came fast. Tax evasion, contempt of a grand jury, conspiracy. One by one, the cases collapsed. Witnesses faded. A contempt conviction was overturned. He was acquitted on tax evasion. By 1974, the remaining federal charges were dropped, partly because of his failing health. He walked free, in his 70s, leaning on a cane. This is the part of the story the movie gets right. The old man living quietly in a modest apartment. For years, he walked his Shih Tzu, Brother, along the sidewalks of Miami Beach, twice a day, like clockwork, so reliably that the FBI surveillance teams set their watches by it. Eating dinner at the same spots, watching television, refusing interviews. The Bureau watched from across the street, certain that somewhere, in some Swiss vault or Bahamian shell company, a fortune was waiting. Did it exist? That's the question the journalist asks in the film. It's the question the FBI asked for decades.
The feds even leaked a story to the press about me having $300 million squirreled away.
Lansky's family always insisted there was no hidden fortune. His granddaughter told author T.J. English that at his death, he left only around $37,000 in cash. His biographer, Robert Lacey, who spent years on the case, concluded that the legendary $300 million was largely a myth, that most of Lansky's money had been lost in Cuba, eaten by lawyers, or quietly skimmed by partners who knew the old man could no longer enforce his cut. Other investigators disagreed. His own daughter, Sandra, said he had transferred at least $15 million to his brother Jake to keep it from the IRS. Some former agents insisted offshore money simply vanished. The truth is probably somewhere in between. There was money, maybe a lot, but likely not the $300 million of legend, and wherever it went with him. On January 15th, 1983, Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach. He was 80 years old. The funeral was small and simple, a brief Orthodox service. His son, Paul, a West Point graduate and Air Force officer who had built an honest life far from his father's, attended. His daughter, Sandra, attended. A handful of family and old friends, no bosses. No flowers from Vegas. The man who had helped build the modern American underworld was buried at Mount Nebo Cemetery in a plain grave. What he left behind is bigger than any vault. He left a model. Many of the offshore techniques used by modern white-collar criminals trace their lineage to methods Lansky and his peers pioneered. Every Las Vegas casino, every Atlantic City resort, every legalized sports book in America today exists in a world that Lansky's generation proved could be enormously profitable. And the federal RICO statute, passed in 1970, was written in part because prosecutors could not catch men who operated the way Lansky did. Lucky Luciano died in 1962 at Naples Airport, waiting to meet a producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. Bugsy Siegel died in a hail of gunfire in 1947. Frank Costello died of a heart attack in 1973. Vito Genovese died in federal prison in 1969. Of the men who sat around that table in Havana in 1946, Lansky was the last one standing. He outlived them all. He outlived the empire he built. He outlived the era. In the film, the journalist asks the old man one final question. Was it worth it? Keitel's Lansky doesn't answer. He just looks out the window at the Florida sun. It's a beautiful shot. It's also fiction. The real Meyer Lansky never gave that interview to that man. He took it with him. And that's the real legacy. Not the money, not the casinos, not the bodies, the silence. Meyer Lansky understood something the loud ones never did. That power is not what you take. Power is what you keep. And the man who keeps his mouth shut, keeps his money hidden, and keeps his name out of the headlines is the most dangerous man in any room. The movie shows you the legend at the end of his life, an old man in a chair telling stories to a journalist. The real story is colder and quieter. A boy of 9 who stepped off a boat, looked at America, and decided he would not be poor, would not be pushed, would not be ruled. He found a partner in Lucky Luciano. He helped build a system the bosses called the Commission. He helped create the financial machinery that turned street rackets into a billion-dollar industry. And when the FBI finally came for him, they found nothing but an old man and a television set tuned to the evening news. They never cracked him. They never found the money. They never got the confession. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment below. Which mob figure should we cover next? Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, or the men who divided the empire when Lansky walked away?